Thanks for coming to the panel today. My name is Raul Macias. I'm an attorney with the ACLU of California, and I manage the ACLU of California's Voting Rights Project. And so we're here today to talk about conditional voter registration. So if everyone's in the right room, we're going to be talking about CVR and how it was implemented in 2018 and what we might see the next time around. So conditional voter registration, that's what we call same-day registration here in California. It was rolled out for the first time in 2018 statewide. CVR, or I'm going to call it CVR throughout, and I think you might hear most of us call it CVR. It allows voters to register and vote after the voter registration deadline. Some form of same-day registration is available in 17 states and the District of Columbia. States with some form of same-day registration tend to have the highest turnout rates in the country. And research shows that they see increased turnout amongst historically disenfranchised voters, so including young voters and low-income voters and voters of color. So the way that California rolled out same-day registration requires voters to cast a provisional ballot so that election officials have the chance to verify a voter's registration and that the voter hasn't voted in that county or in another county before they are allowed to count that ballot. In 2018, election officials were required to provide access to conditional voter registration at their county elections office, and they had the option of providing additional satellite locations. The rules that the Secretary of State set for conditional voter registration said that if a county wanted to provide satellite locations, that those locations had to be able to identify a voter's correct ballot type, and they had to have every ballot type available at those satellite locations. So that wasn't necessarily an easy thing for elections officials to provide. And so what we saw in 2018, that there were only 5 counties that decided to provide a CVR location on election day in November. So in the rest of the counties, not including the VCA counties, the rest of the counties had just the only option for using CVR, accessing CVR on election day was at the county elections office. So the good news was that, as you heard earlier, there were over 57,000 voters who did access conditional voter registration. But what we saw was that those votes were disproportionately cast in the VCA counties, where CVR was more widely available. So, for example, there were 170% more CVR votes cast in Sacramento than in Los Angeles County, even though LA has about 6 times the number of voters. We also saw lines at elections offices across the state, and a lot of that was due to voters who were hoping to access conditional voter registration on election day. We heard reports of lines of up to 4 hours in some counties. And then, in perspective, overall 57,000 voters, that makes up about 1% of the state's unregistered voters. So meaning about 1% of the state's unregistered voters took advantage of CVR on election day in November 2018. And it makes up less than 0.5% of the total votes cast in November. And so to put that in perspective, in Wisconsin, where election day registration is available at all polling sites, election day registration votes have represented up to around 15% of ballots cast on election day. So we really lag behind in terms of the actual use of our version of election day registration. So, and I'd also point out, according to some data that we got from CACEO, there were about 50,000 voters who cast a provisional ballot at a polling site who didn't have their votes count because they were not registered to vote. And again, at polling sites, voters weren't able to register and vote in November. So this year, the legislature is looking at a number of ways to expand access to CVR, including by requiring that it be made available before election day at more satellite locations. And also, the legislature is looking at requiring that all polling sites make CVR available. And today, we have a great panel that can help us understand a little bit more about how CVR was rolled out in 2018 and what we might see going forward. So I'll introduce our panel now. I think everyone here is probably familiar with Mindy Romero. She's the founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project, and she's one of our go-to researchers in the state on all election-related issues. We have Gail Pellerin, who's the registrar of Santa Cruz County, who is also a past president of CACEO, a founding member of Future of California Elections, and is one of our go-to elections officials for all election-related questions. And we also have Elisa Chang He, who's the CalPERG Student New Voter Project Campaign Coordinator at UC Riverside. Yeah, go Anteaters, right? And she's going to tell us about a really She's going to tell us a little bit about the really exciting registration work she did on campus. Really incredible. They registered thousands of voters, and she worked to turn out voters on Election Day, and is going to talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that students see and why they might be able to take advantage of more access to conditional voter registration. So we'll also have some time for questions at the end, but we're going to start with Mindy, who's going to share some data with us about the use of CVR and what we know about registered and unregistered voters in California.
Okay. Hello again. How are you? I was just going to say, doing okay after lunch and end of the day? You guys are the diehards, right? That means the expectation is on us here. We've got to really pull out the panel to justify you staying as long as you have, right? Okay, so I'm going to just give a broad overview, really getting at why is CVR, I mean, Raul just articulated it really well, but why is CVR needed? What is the state of registration in California? In a few minutes, at least. So, you can see that? Just as a reminder, 5.3, 5.5, depending on the data source that you're using, but there are a lot of Californians who are eligible but not registered to vote. Youth and those of color have high percentages of non-registered, right, compared with whites and older Californians. And just a note, if you didn't know, California's version of CVR currently is a little bit more limited than other states, in that, particularly at the site, the fact that it's at the folks who are allowed to use it is available at your elections office or a satellite. Not yet at any polling place, but yes, at vote centers. Okay, so what's the state of registration in California? We've been hearing a lot over the day about automatic voter registration, new motor voter law. We've heard a lot about the surge in registration. Sounds pretty good, right? We're at a record number of registrants. Sounds like we've got a lot of Californians registered. But we also still have a lot of Californians who are not registered. And let me give it to you in terms of rates, because when we look at just total numbers, and that's something we should be talking about and celebrating, it doesn't give us the real sense of what the disparity is across groups. So what is the registration rate? Right, it's the percent of those that are eligible, right, who are actually eligible to register and to vote, who are actually registered. So this is as of the November election, so obviously we've registered a few more people since then, but we'll go with these numbers. So 78.9%, that was not a record for this type of election, but it was the highest that we've seen in a very, very, very long time. So basically 80%, right, of Californians, regardless of race, ethnicity, age, were registered to vote, who are eligible to vote. But if you look at it by race, ethnicity, right, there are pretty significant disparities. 68% for Latinos, 57% for Asian Americans, youth, 61%. That number, though, sounds not so great, right, for young people. It's actually a pretty huge jump. Jen knows. Typically, we see young people, their registration rate at maybe 50, 52, 54, depending on the election. We saw all groups increase, at least the main demographic groups that we tend to analyze. But we saw the biggest jump for young people, right, a larger jump, so up to 61%, but still obviously, still significantly under-registered. Okay. And I say jump from 2014. Oopsie, if I can get this to work for me. Now, there's a lot of numbers here. Don't worry about the numbers so much. I just want to show you a visual story. So on the far right, 2018, are the numbers that I just gave you. 78.9% for everybody, registration rate 68% for Latinos, 57% for Asian Americans. We also were able to calculate for these data, these are data that are derived actually from PDI statewide database. Actual voter records, we're not able to identify, unfortunately, whites and African Americans. But what we are able to do is to subtract Latinos and Asian Americans from the data set. So we get everybody that's non-Latino, non-Asian, if that makes sense, which in a state like California actually is about 86% white. So much higher rate for those that are non-Latino, non-Asian. But if you look back across just these elections that I'm showing you, midterm or presidential, Don't look at the exact numbers, but do you notice anything that seems pretty consistent? You see a story of disparity, right? Now, with new motor voter, we're going into a new age. We do expect to see a more representative over time registration rolls, right? Registered electorate, not necessarily voters, that's a different story. But still, coming out of the November election, we still saw pretty significant disparities. So why do registration disparities matter? Anyone? Let me wake you up kind of wake you up. I'm asking you a question at least. Yeah?
Well, certain groups are underrepresented compared to their total presence in the population.
So there's underrepresentation by race, ethnicity in terms of the registered voter rolls. What does that translate to?
Election outcomes.
And I'm thinking more specifically just turnout, right? But yes, and all the way to election outcomes, certainly. So being able to select the candidates or issues that matter to you in your community. Oops. You didn't see that slide. Because, so we still have a two-step voter registration system here in the United States, right? And in California, you have to be registered before you can vote. Disparities in registration mean that when you get to election day, or election period now, if you're going to be, say, the county, even with conditional voter registration, as we know, some big numbers, but still in the big picture, as Raul said, a very, very small percentage. Most people are still not aware, right, that conditional voter registration is available. So for all intents and purposes, you pass a registration deadline. If you think something gets you, something mobilizes you, you may be thinking that you don't have that access anymore, right? It's a very important tool, but gaining greater access, greater understanding of that tool is really important. So you have to register. We have disparities in registration. So we don't start with a level playing field when it comes to potential turnout and a representative turnout. So let me just give you a few numbers really quickly. Many of you will know these already. But I think the Secretary of State also at the beginning of the day gave you the registered voter. No, he gave you the registered, not the eligible voter turnout. So the eligible voter turnout last November was, and that's, by the way, the percent of those eligible to vote, citizens of voting age. Do you know what it was?
47%.
For the state as a whole.
No, it was 60, wasn't it 61?
So 50. Yeah, so 60. So what the number they gave, that the Secretary of State gave earlier was registered voter turnout. Eligible voter turnout, 50%, 50.5 precisely. Do you know what it was for Latinos? 30? 36? 36. So I stopped taking numbers. What about, in all seriousness, a pretty big gap, right, still present. This is, remember the context of, what have we been hearing about the November election? Record turnout, highest since 1982, whether it was registered or whether you're looking at eligible, the highest since 1982. Sounds pretty exciting, right? Might make you also think that maybe some of the work has already been done. But a highest since 82 is still 50%. And when we break it out by subgroups, we see significant disparities, right? And I'm just showing you a few here. Asian American, 33. And when I don't have young people, oopsie, I can't do this. If you're wondering, young people age 18 to 24 was 27%, regardless of race, ethnicity. Break it out by youth of color, lower than that, right? The numbers that we're using are very similar.
It's adjusted slightly from the census, and so if those people are underrepresented in the census, that's even worse.
Yes, you could say that.
It's even worse in reality.
Yeah. But our data is from our CVAP data, eligible population data, is actually from the California Department of Finance, which is adjusted and based on census largely. Okay. So let's move on here. If I can do that, because I can't apparently work two things at once. But hopefully it's at least somewhat entertaining. So let me just show you, I showed you a moment ago the last few elections for registration rates. Now let's look at turnout rates, right? So on the far right, those numbers I just gave you, including non-Latino and non-Asian as well, for 2018. You go across, right, the last few elections. The difference here is that because it's turnout, we're going to see highs and lows from a midterm to a presidential, higher turnout in a presidential, generally lower turnout in a midterm. But whether it's high turnout or low turnout, what do you see? Disparities. Disparities are entrenched, right? Registration rates are much more stable over time, but disparities are entrenched there as well. Okay. Let me show you just CVR, and I know Raul's already given some numbers. 57,000 for the state as a whole is reported by the Secretary of State. This is, see, I can't do this. There you go. There's the 57,000, 19% for Sacramento. Let me move on. I want to show you, if it allows me to. There we go. The non-registered eligible voting population in California. So all those that are eligible to vote and to register that are not actually registered. Make sense? Pardon? Oh, you're teasing me about my non-technical skills?
No, we're
Oh, my lack of coordination. But hey, I own it. 25 million citizens of voting age in California. 5.3 that are not registered. 21% of the overall population. But if you look across by, again, just these simple categories that I'm showing you, Asian American, much higher. Latino, again, this is percent of eligible to register who are not registered. 31% for Latino young people, regardless of race or ethnicity, 38%. Okay, I'm getting better. Okay. Now let me just show you for VCA counties, since we just talked about them. You look at, let's just keep it simple and look at the bottom row, which is VCA counties combined. Total population, again, of those that are eligible to vote that aren't, the percentage that aren't actually registered. 23.8% versus 46% for Asian American, 39% for Latino, 39% for youth. And these are in counties, as we've talked about today, that by and large before the VCA were already doing better in terms of turnout. Pretty significant disparities, right? Yeah.
Why is it that we don't have African Americans as a category?
Great question. It's the limitations of the data. So these data are from actual voter records. We're able to identify through surname matching and other means Asian American and Latino. We're not able to reliably identify white and African American for researchers. People can use these data in a myriad of ways, very effective ways, for campaigns and other ways, but for researchers looking across geographies over time, there's just not the consistency in the data for us, unfortunately. We will look at African American white with other data sources, but for these, that's a limitation. Did I answer your question? Okay. So, moving on. Now, that was VCA counties. Let's look at new VCA counties if you're curious. These are all the counties that are going to be adopting, including Santa Clara. We've got 15.6% of the total population eligible that's not registered versus 38 versus 26 versus 30. Okay. And lastly, if I can get it to work for me. Oh, there we go. There. And lastly, we are actually embarking on a study looking at conditional voter registration in California. We have a multi-method study looking at using the voter file, as well as doing some survey analysis, surveys of counties as well, election offices as well, to try to understand a number of questions. First, doing a breakout of who's using CVR by race, ethnicity, and other groups. Also, as much as we can measure it, the experience as a voter is using CVR in California. At vote centers as well as county elections offices. And ultimately, we hope to also better understand kind of the options that election offices across counties are actually providing, and what those differences and options mean in terms of experiences for voters. And that's it. There we go. Thank you. I'm forgetting this is my computer.
All right, so next up we have Gail Pelham from Santa Cruz County.
Where's the clicker thingy? you. You're so good at that. Okay, so conditional voter registration, this is basically from a county registrar point of view. Let me get my notes. Okay, so same day vote, we call it same day voter registration. And in Santa Cruz County, we have 159,599 registered voters, and we ended up doing same day voter registration at 3 locations. Our county main office. We always conduct early voting over at Watsonville City Clerk's office. We are a county that is a lot of geographic areas, so our South County is where we have a lot of Latinos, and we want to make sure that we have great service down there. So for years now, decades, we've had a vote center of sorts operating out of the City Clerk's office where people could come in and get a ballot 29 days before the election. And then we are also the home of UCSC, and that is a population of students that I'm a mother of 2 college students, and they wake up on election day and they go, it's election day. And wait a minute, I'm registered in Los Angeles, and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon because I just woke up. It's important that we have a center there to serve our voters, but we didn't do it for, we did it Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, just 4 days. And what was important in launching our same-day voter registration center is messaging. And we worked with the Future California Elections and the Center for Civic Design on developing a toolkit. Social media was really key in getting the word out as far as what voters' rights were and what they were allowed to do. Working with our local media and doing news releases and what we call the golden slip at the polls. So if you went to the polling site and you were not found on the roster and they called us and we determined that you were not registered anywhere in Santa Cruz County, the voter was given a golden slip, their golden ticket, that explained to them that they can go to one of these 3 centers and register and vote on election day to have their vote count. Okay. So what we did is that there was a handout with FAQs, and that FoCE toolkit is amazing, and I put the website there where you can download that, where there's information about, there's a flyer. So we worked with the wording on how to explain this. I mean, laws are crazy because they use really, words that people don't use in everyday life. Conditional voter registration, what does that mean? And how does that impact us? So we work to get the right messaging here, and basically, if you're talking to someone, hey, you missed the voter registration deadline. Well, you still have time to register and vote. And what does that take to do? So we did a handout that was pretty easy for people to understand. And when you use plain language, it also helps in the translation of that document. So we did have that handout bilingual as well. And then we worked on a number of graphics. My daughter has FOMO really bad. Does everybody you guys all know what FOMO means? One person, a young person. Okay. Fear of missing out. This is huge for our younger generation, right? They don't like to miss out. So I kind of use that language as far as, hey, you missed out on the voter registration deadline. You can still register and vote up to and including Election Day. We use Canva, which is free, and so we've done a number of graphics that we put out on social media and made available to all the counties in the state as well. And that is our golden slip that was bilingual, English on one side, Spanish on the other, explaining to voters that, hey, it's okay if you're not registered in Santa Cruz County, you can still register and vote on today. You just need to go to one of these 3 locations. We also provided rides should somebody not be able to get themselves from point A to point B.
Your office did.
Huh?
Your office gave rides.
Yes. Or we worked with volunteers that would give rides as well. I can't read this at all. Okay. So our numbers. We had 2,015 CVRs that were counted in Santa Cruz County. Cheers for us. That's a great number. In the state, there were 57,275 that were counted statewide. So we were actually 3.5% of the total counted in the state, yet we make up less than 8% of the registered voters of the state. So we did really well. I think per capita, I think we were up there as one of the highest. So again, I love putting pictures out there. So this is our CVR center in Santa Cruz, where we had 983 voters. One of them was a turtle. And that is our mascot for the Santa Cruz Warrior D-League team. And they came in and did conditional vote, same-day voter registration to help us publicize the availability of this new service. So, so we got a lot of media coverage on that. Yes, we had lines, and I saw earlier that I think it was on your stuff, a registrar said that if you have lines at a vote center, that's a sign that you're not successful or something. I think it's success. If you have lines, people are there and they're wanting to do this. Hopefully they don't have to wait too long. But you know, how long do you wait to go see a premiere of a movie? You know, or how long do you wait in line to get a Cinnabon at the county fair? You know, I mean, so, you know, we're in line to vote. So let's make our priorities clear. Okay, and in Watsonville, we had 251 voters who took advantage of the same-day voter registration there. And you see one of them using the touchscreen, so we did allow voters to vote. Every voter coming in to vote is offered paper or touchscreen. The voter decides. We don't make any determination on what method you use to vote. And we have voters voting on paper or voting on touchscreen. And this was UCSC. This was UCSC Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Do they look busy? No.
Time to lean, time to clean.
They were not busy. We were there all day Saturdays. I think we had a handful of students that came in. Tuesday was a different story. Tuesday, we were printing ballots from 8 in the morning until 7 p.m. at night for UCSC. And we ended up with, I can't read my number here, 844 people taking advantage of same-day voter registration on campus. That's a huge number. We worked in partnership with our county administrative office. Our county administrative officer is amazing. I actually sent him out looking for an inspector one time on election morning because she didn't show up with the voting equipment. And he drove all over Salinas looking for her and fought pit bulls and all sorts of things until we finally found her. But anyway, his office provided us with staff that were out at this center on election day all day. We also employed students who were out there on election day, and then our extra help staff that were highly trained, and they were exhausted. We had lines out the door, and it was amazing how many students took advantage of this, and they were okay. I didn't get anybody complaining about a line on election day at UCSC. In our office I did, but not at UCSC. What's this website? Okay, all right, what's new? So we have Senate Bill 72 by Umberg, which basically says same-day voter registration will be at all polling sites. And in 2018, only 5 non-VCA counties provided conditional voter registration on election day beyond their permanent offices. We were one of them, along with Santa Barbara, San Bernardino, Merced, El Dorado. And as Raul said earlier, there are 17 states plus the District of Columbia that offer some form of same-day voter registration. So there's some good things about expanding same-day to the polling sites. Voters will vote. And in November 2018, we had 795 voters who cast a provisional ballot at a polling site. They did not heed the golden slip, or they did not get it, who were not registered to vote. So we were not allowed to count those votes. So turnout will increase. In November, of our turnout of 76.31%, if we were able to count those 795 votes, our turnout would have been up to 76.81%. I call that a solid C. If you're getting a grade on a test, I do this with my voters in Santa Cruz County all the time. I think we should be up in the A category, not in the 70% categories. Also, I think it's equal treatment of voters. So allowing voters to register and vote at any polling site is similar to what vote center counties do. And it's easier for voters to go to a neighborhood polling site than to go to one of the main county elections office or one of our satellite locations. The cons to expansion is the polling places are not connected to our voter registration database, so they cannot look up voters to obtain the information. Poll workers are one-day volunteers, bless their hearts, I love them to death, but they are not as familiar with the California Elections Code and as our election officials that do work in the centers. So we have more expertise when we have the fewer centers that we operate. And some feel that same-day voter registration will allow unlawful votes to be cast. There's also issues with voters getting the wrong ballot type. So if you're at a facility in a polling site in Watsonville, but you live in Santa Cruz, you're not going to get the correct ballot type for based on where you live. And we did have in 2018, 16 of our same-day voter registration voters we discovered had already voted. So they had already cast a ballot in the county where they were living or whether they were registered, and then came in on election day and went to one of our centers and registered and voted there. That's illegal. And I think a lot of people just don't understand that. And, was it fraud, or was that just sort of not really understanding what it means to vote and that you only get to vote once in one location for one election? I caught them, yes. And they're in jail now. No. I don't know where they are. They're not my voters. Okay. The votes were not counted. No, we caught those and the votes were not counted. In 2020, Santa Cruz County will, and we're going to do this regardless of what happens with the Umberg bill, but we're going to expand the number of same-day voter registration centers from 3 to 10. And so the locations must be accessible, near public transportation, and provide ample parking, convenient based on where voters live, so we don't want them all in one area, we want to spread them around the county. Be able to provide good internet connectivity. I mean, having that internet connection that is secure is huge, and being able to secure the facility as well. And we're going to be doing them on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. We're not doing them like a vote center does them for 10 days prior. We're just going to be doing them Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And hopefully that will help with the lines as well. So, and then that's just me. And Santa Cruz, this was actually a Halloween costume for just a random voter. I love my voters in Santa Cruz County. And they went out on election day and stood on a street corner to encourage people to vote. So I love that. That's it.
Yeah, hello. And so next we're going to hear from Ramla Sahid. She's the Executive Director of Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans. She's responsible for overseeing the organization's growth and prominence as a multiracial refugee and Muslim organizing civic engagement hub. And she's based in San Diego County and is going to speak to the experience accessing CVR there.
Thanks, Raul. Okay, awesome. And we found you on Twitter.
What's that?
We found you. There's a whole Twitter chat mentioning you. Hi, everyone. My name is Ramla. I'm in San Diego, and we're working with refugees and newcomers who have since naturalized and are registered to vote but have not voted. And our goal and our hope is to increase their participation, their visibility, and their impact in the region, in their new home, and to have a relationship with the people who are responsible for making public policies that impact their lives. And so to do that, the work is not just election day, right? It's around the clock, it's year-long, it's multi-year, and we're really fortunate enough to, because we're only 5 years old, we're really fortunate enough to have the support of California Calls and Power California as two organizations who are doing really impactful statewide work to give small groups like PANA the technology, the TA, the support to be able to do this in big ways. So PANA is a research public policy and organizing hub. We're more known for our organizing, our grassroots organizing, and we're a multiracial community, meaning we're organizing with refugees from the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And we engage in research because it's important to us that our people are having conversations about the issues that impact their lives, that they're connecting that to community experiences, and then the civic engagement part is really connecting that or lifting that up to public leadership, right? In San Diego, just quick numbers, we've resettled a little over 86,000 refugees since 1975. and about 1 in 38 San Diegans arrived here as a refugee. Now that number does not take into account secondary migration, so people who move from places like, I don't know, South Carolina, and then say, San Diego seems like a better place or home for me, or the children that are born to refugee families, like my baby brothers. To give you an update on San Diego and what happened at the polls, the nightmare that was, I have a quick video to show you. This is a good example of why some lines are bad. Some lines are really bad. I don't know how to click, though, or make it work. They're going to make it work? Okay.
The guaranteed grand prize for the San Diego Dreamhouse raffle, a benefit for
Don't
Ronald
mind the
McDonald
commercial.
House Charities of San Diego. Call 1-888-824-9939 and get your tickets right now.
Oh, here comes the pizza. This is what I was hoping to see.
So the lines were so bad, people were waiting hours. Some random rich dude or girl bought pizza for everyone. That's it. So you saw the lines. They're literally wrapping around the building. It was a nightmare. And if you consider elders, people with diabetes, people who have health conditions, it's not a good look, right? It's dangerous, actually. So it was really great to have an anonymous pizza donor feed everyone. But that's a really good example of why it doesn't work. And this is for folks who are English speaking, who have transportation, who know how to get to the county voter registrar's office, and who are self-sufficient. And so groups like PANA were, so we had a party bus that day. So our youth engaged in an art-making project in which a few days before the election, they basically created sort of a whole party around the elections. They rented a van, a 16-passenger van, they decorated it, they identified one specific location, and that central location became sort of the place where elders and people could come, could have snacks, could party, could hang out, but also could get rides to the polls and have someone with them who spoke the language. And some of the folks that I took to the county voter registrars were mostly the elders, the people who weren't sure that they were registered to vote and needed to register that same day and vote. What was good about that is because I was taking elders, we were able to sort of get ahead of the line. That took a while, right? Of course, there's no interpreter who speaks their language, so I'm interpreting for 8 people at the same time. And so we walked in, so we do the whole paperwork, we walk into the rooms where the vote is happening, and a lot of those seats are empty. Why? Because the people are in line waiting to get processed. So there was insufficient staffing because more people could have been packing that room voting, right? So it was clear to us that people were being processed fast enough to get to the room and sit and vote. It was really difficult for people who had specialized needs or specific language needs to get access to the vote because there was literally no help unless you were Vietnamese, Spanish-speaking, maybe Arabic. What we learned, though, is if you weren't engaging in same-day voter registration for those folks who were already registered, who showed up at the party site and got rights to the polls, there were more people, neighbors, who were willing to step up and help somebody vote, right? So our staff weren't so, the burden wasn't on them only. So we ended up with a lot more volunteers than we actually thought we had. So that was really great. And the work of identifying where those polling locations are, where people will have specific language impacts, was really important to begin with. So our strategy for how we build that kind of culture of voting is through building community leadership. So we're engaging year-round organizing leadership development. We're using we have a monthly steering community council in which our core members are developing the strategies, engaging in goal development, and are really taking ownership of the work. And then the vote is, the end of the year that the end of the cycle is really then people are voting on their interests. People understand what they're voting on. People have some connection to what's going to be on the ballot and understanding. So that's why we organize. These are some of the folks who are doing really the dope work that we are engaged in. And this is what that looks like, right? So the town halls are really important because that's when people are getting the rapid response information of know your rights, the Muslim ban stuff. We're going to be engaging us in a series of town halls around the census now, the citizenship question. We're also going to be doing a know your rights on search warrants and surveillance because those are things that are increasingly becoming problematic in our communities, and we're going to start increasingly trying to educate people about the role of the DA's office, and so that is how that works, right? The issues need to be connected to the ballot, to the vote, so that there's a relationship beyond it's election day and it's your responsibility. That there's some real ways that they can connect it back to their lives and the way it impacts them. So rallies and actions, so what happens after we vote? We need to have a relationship with our lawmakers, but what happens when we get ignored? So showing up, showing out, getting loud, and creating that culture of accountability in that relationship has also been really important for building out our membership and growing the membership of PANA. That is my contact information. One thing that I will say is, again, I can't stress enough the need for people to have the ability to register and vote in their home polling location, somewhere they can walk to, because it's more likely that there's a neighbor there who already speaks that language that can help that person vote. Or it's accessible enough that they can walk, if the family can walk together and vote together. The culture of voting it becomes more efficient, it becomes more accessible when folks have more ways to vote, more opportunities to get a ballot, and also when they're connected and rooted in power building strategies with community organizations that serve their needs. And we can't forget that. Part of building a culture of and turnout, increasing turnout, is really making sure that people are really connected to power organizations in which they feel like their needs are being addressed. They're being connected to the elected leaders that can help them address some of the concerns that they are having in their local communities. And then also, we're talking about representation, we're talking about leadership development and boards and commissions and some of those other ways that people can engage in, not just the vote.
Thank you, Ramala. And if folks want to start filling out their questions, to send them out, there's someone collecting those, and we'll have some time for more of those. And so next up we have Elisa to speak about the experience in Riverside. And for some context, Riverside County was another county where there were no satellite locations on Election Day, and so there was no satellite location on campus.
Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Elisa. I'm a fourth year studying education and psychology currently at UC Riverside. And last year, I was very heavily involved with our New Voters Project as the campaign coordinator during the midterm elections. For those of you guys that don't know, the New Voters Project is one of our nation's oldest and largest nonpartisan youth voter mobilization efforts. I actually became involved through CalPERC students last year. I joined through my interest in renewable energy, and just after a few months in being in this organization, we actually had a really, really big win over the summer. And through this, I was able to recognize that when we actually collect the voices of our student body and the voices of the people that are in our communities, and then we take those voices to key decision makers, we actually are able to make a difference on these issues on a local level, a community level, a statewide level, and then eventually even a nationwide level. Right after that, I actually became the campaign coordinator for the New Voters Project, and it was a very political campaign in the sense that it made me recognize the importance of civic engagement and the importance of having people in our communities that are actually participating in our communities and having active voices in these communities. And so last midterm elections, we were actually able to register 6,000 students to register across the state. 1,000 of those came from Riverside. Our goal was 500, but we actually doubled it. So thank you. And we actually also got 500,000 Get Out the Vote contacts across the state. So the tactics that we utilize are grassroots tactics on college campuses to mobilize college students. These tactics include voter education, voter registration, and then voter activation through our Get Out the Vote drive. Just to kind of go through it, voter education, because like Gail was mentioning earlier, a lot of students don't know they have to register to actually vote, which is kind of seems crazy, but they don't know about these things. And a lot of students wake up on election day without knowing it's election day until they were reminded in class. So a variety of different tactics in order to educate the student body. We registered a lot of the students by actually doing class announcements with physical voter registration forms. So what we would do is we would go to these classes, make an announcement about the importance of voting and educating them on the different issues that pertain to voting, and then actually having them vote right there on the spot with voter registration forms, which we then went and cross-checked because college students also don't know how to fill out registration forms. And so that was like another thing that we did. And we utilized a lot of other grassroots tactics like clipboarding and tabling around hotspots in college campuses where we knew there was a lot of foot traffic with college students. And through Vote Coalition work also, we worked a lot with our campus community, with ASUCR, our Res Life people, like a bunch of people in these different strategic locations off campus where students collect. And we were able to work with them as well in order to register and mobilize as many students as we could. And during the voter activation phase of this kind of drive, we were able to have a lot of Get Out the Vote pushes. Like she was mentioning earlier, lots of really cool visibility. We had a vote goat on campus, and a lot of people actually voted because of the goat, which was really, really cool. But also just a lot of parties at the polls to keep students engaged while they were in line, right? So a lot of tactics like this. And so the really good thing that I think we were able to recognize from the last midterm election is that a lot of students are actually turning out to vote. Like the youth is starting to recognize the importance of voting and really getting out there. But the problem is that we have all these barriers that are in place that are actually gonna stop students from voting even if they want to. And so I actually wanted to highlight some of these problems that we saw across the state. I know that UCLA's campus actually had a centralized polling location, which was really, really cool. But there were a lot of students that weren't registered that wanted to vote but couldn't because the nearest conditional voter registration site, which allows for same-day voter registration, was actually a 2 to 3 hour drive away. And a lot of those students couldn't make that commute, and so they couldn't turn out to the polls. I know that at UC Riverside, because I was there, our polling location actually had a line that ran really, really long because we actually ran out of the 1,000 provisional ballots that we had on our campus at 8 p.m. and we had students waiting over 5 hours in line to vote because after we ran out of provisional ballots, there was just one machine that took 30 minutes per person for each student to vote. And so there were many students that left discouraged because they had finals the next day, because they had to go to sleep. Students that had been waiting 2-3 hours in line already that said, oh, I can't stay in line anymore, it's 11 p.m. And we didn't even know that we were going to obtain extra provisional ballots. Like the registrar's office came in around midnight with brand new provisional ballots, and so a lot of students were able to get registered and go home. But a lot of students didn't even know whether or not we would be able to get those ballots. But we were still able to keep 100 people in line because we tried to kind of keep them entertained by having a lot of games, candy, and we were able to bring in a lot of pizza. Yeah, chocolates, and a lot of like pizza, which we also ran out of because of the sheer size of people that were there. But despite the fact that there were a lot of people there, the important thing to recognize is that even more people had to go home because they were discouraged and because they couldn't wait in that line that long. And I think another important thing to highlight is one of the reasons why we had to have so many provisional ballots at UC Riverside is actually because a lot of the students that were actually registered through the dorm. And those of you that work in college campuses may recognize this, but a lot of the students that worked in the dorms, if they didn't put in their unit or simply because they were in the dorms, the address was not counted as a residential address meaning that a lot of these students actually weren't registered and had to vote provisionally. And so this actually became a really, really big problem that created such a big line. And it was an even bigger problem because typically students that are dorming are not commuters. On our campus, students are not allowed to have a parking permit until they are 30 years, meaning that a lot of these students don't have access to go to our registrar's office for conditional voter registration on the day of. And so there were a lot of students that were discouraged from voting, a lot of students that couldn't vote because they weren't registered, a lot of students that just couldn't vote generally. And these were like a lot of the issues that we wanted to highlight and bring to the table because the student experience is also very different in that regard. And also, one of the things that I did want to highlight was from the turnout, like we were able to assess the data, and I think it was 80% of the students that voted that day were registered. It was like 81%, compared to the 90% across the state. I think those were the statistics, like, right?
I think that was the rate of provisional ballots that were cast in Riverside as opposed to the rest of the state.
Yeah, so there were a lot of students that weren't registered when they casted those provisional ballots, and so that rate was also kind of disproportionately affecting our community, which I think is also important to highlight. And that's why it's important for us to recognize kind of why it is that we need to bring these conditional voter registration sites. Every midterm election, we see the exact same barriers. Like these are barriers that historically have existed in like on our campus, and we were aware of. And every election cycle, we say, we're gonna do something about it, we're gonna start sooner. But every election cycle, we say the exact same thing, right? And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we bring these conditional voter registration sites on campus, because a lot of the times, the conditional registration sites that are at the registrar's office are not accessible to students. A lot of students are lazy and they wake up on the day of without having registered, or not even lazy, like they just don't know, right? And so for a lot of these reasons, I think it's really important that we do bring conditional voter registration sites onto college campuses. College campuses host a huge majority of the population that is here in terms of like the youth. And these are kind of like a lot of the problems and issues that we dealt with and faced. And I did want to highlight that, like Gail mentioned earlier, at UC Santa Cruz, there actually was a conditional voter registration site. And conditional voter registration sites haven't existed, so it's really exciting that students that weren't registered are able to register in the first place. But in Santa Cruz, where they did have a conditional voter registration site, we had over 800 students that registered on the same day of elections. And that was really exciting. And I think that's something that we should actually bring across all other campuses across the state so that we can really mobilize the youth when it comes to our 2020 elections. And one more thing that I did want to talk about was in terms of like centralized polling locations. At UC Riverside, one of the bigger barriers that we dealt with was the inaccessibility of the polling location that we had. Our polling location was a 20-minute walk from the center of campus, up some hills, up some stairs, into this discreet remote area that nobody really knew. So a lot of our visibility and our push during the Get Out the Vote drive was just making a lot of arrows and chalking up the grounds and putting up a lot of flyers, telling people how to get there because students didn't know how to get there. And so because of that, a lot of students didn't even vote because they just couldn't find it or didn't know where it was or couldn't get there. And so UCLA actually was able to bring a centralized polling location on their campus where they had the campus community just go to like their huge, I think it was a gym or a huge SRC, and they were all able to kind of go to that one location in order to vote. And so I think it's also really important to work with college campuses in order to create that centralized place where a lot of students could go, and also potentially bringing satellite sites to campuses because like UC Riverside, we're a very big commuter campus, and so a lot of students they can't drop off their ballots or they can't vote in the area because then their votes don't count. And so those were some of the experiences that we dealt with as students, and this is why we recognize the importance of conditional voter registration sites and why we want to bring same-day voter registration sites onto our campuses. Thank you.
Thank you, and congrats on the great work. So, since we talked about SB 72 a little bit, I just want to give a little more explanation. What this bill would do, it says that in non-VCA counties, so right in VCA counties, conditional voter registration is available at every vote center. What SB 72 says is that in counties that aren't participating in the VCA, and as we heard, that's about half of the state in 2020, or counties that have half of the voters in the state, they would have to provide conditional voter registration at every polling site. And what the bill says is that counties would have flexibility in terms of how they could provide that. Either they would do sort of the low-tech version, right, would be just you give people the ballot that's available at that polling site, or you register the voter, you give them the ballot that's available at that polling site. The bill says an election official can try to direct the voter to the correct polling site if it turns out that's not their polling site, but that the voter would still be allowed to cast a ballot there, just like any other voter can. A registered voter can go into any polling site and can cast a provisional vote there. But it also says counties, if they have the technology to identify the correct ballot type and to actually provide the correct ballot type, that would be they would be allowed to do that as well. So I wanted to give some more information because that's come up a few times, but also I guess I'll start with the first question for Gail in terms of what are the sort of challenges that can you speak a little more to the challenges that poses to elections officials and in terms of technology, training, and resources?
Well, I mean, if it were offered every polling site, well, they're not connected to the internet and they don't have access to our voter file, so they wouldn't be able to look up the voter to get that exact information. We do have information on our website that people could look up and get their ballot type, but not every, I mean, Santa Cruz County, there's a lot of rural areas that don't have any internet connection at all, so you don't get cell service very much. And then it's the training issue. We have poll workers out there that work, 1, 2 elections every couple years, and they just aren't trained on everything. So the quality and accuracy of what they do is not always to the same level as the staff that we have that's been trained. So, and poll workers are trained. We do a 2-hour training, and there's written information. There's a hotline they could call, but, it doesn't always happen. And you will have voters who will be voting on a ballot that's not their correct ballot type. And then what that means on the back end is that we need to have duplication boards that basically take the ballot they should have voted and then the ballot they did vote and then transfer those votes over to the ballot they should have voted. And then that just goes to increase our canvassing time to certify the election.
We have a few questions about, well, let me see if I can try to generalize, but to everyone on the panel, I mean, sometimes I think when we hear about the need for same-day registration, or there's some frustration amongst that we hear that, well, registration's available online, people can register all the way up, until 14 days before the election, and that 15 days before the election, excuse me, and that people can go to the county elections office if they wanted to, and the elections are in the news already. Why don't people know the rules? I think you hear frustration and just sort of questions about sometimes, you'll hear people say, people get enough chances. If they can't figure it out, why should we bother? And I'd be open up to the panel in terms of the challenges you see and what we know about the challenges that voters face and why people might not realize they need to register to vote. Who wants to start?
So I guess the way I would answer that for my population, again, my groups are refugees, asylum seekers, or former refugees and asylum seekers from the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And a lot of them, so they're listening to ethnic media. They're not necessarily plugged in to local channels. I don't know many families who still have cable. Does that exist anymore? But I guess my greater point is different people have different ways of getting their information, right? Oftentimes the information about the vote and registering vote, the rules, all of that is inaccessible. If you're limited English proficient, you don't really know how to navigate the internet very well, except the few ethnic media sites that your children helped you learn how to access, how do you actually get that information, right? The other is a lot of folks think they're registered, but then you learn they don't know all the rules, so they move, and now they're not registered. They're not registered at their current location, and so those are all the ways that people, I think, miss those opportunities. And so And I think our goal is to make this an opt-out process, right? That people should they should have access to the right to vote, period. And the opt-out is they don't show up on vote day. You give people every available chance that they're able, that we can afford them to get out the vote. And we try to eliminate some of the barriers, including language. Not a lot of the languages that I work with are threshold languages, so they're not going to get information, on the ballot in their language, and so someone has to sit there and interpret it for them. A lot of people don't write and read in their own language, and so even if we were to translate it in Swahili, some of my Congolese women aren't going to be able to read that, and so you're still going to need a lot of that support, a lot of that TA, and that's why community is so important, and community building around the vote and making that a cultural thing is so important in our communities.
Just to add to what she was saying, one of the things that we're actually prioritizing heavily this year is the institutionalization of voter registration on college campuses. So this means that we're going to embed voter registration into our system, embed the get out the vote into our system and into our culture, like she was mentioning. Because one of the things is that somebody might be reminded to vote once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and they still won't vote until maybe even until the 20th time. And so what we're trying to do is embed it in every step of the process. So a student is coming into school, orientation day, they're reminded to vote. Move-in day, they're reminded to vote. In their classes, they're reminded to vote. It's embedded in every single step of the way so that they are constantly reminded that this is a present issue, and they're constantly reminded that this is something that's important and needs to be done. And I think that I completely agree with this whole process of maybe it should be an opt-out process. Maybe it shouldn't be something that students, in the sense that it should be something that is so kind of embedded into our system that students are able to recognize, or students are constantly reminded to actually register to vote and then to turn out to the polls. Because I think that one of the biggest barriers to voter registration is simply the lack of education on the issue. A lot of students don't know that they need to be registered to vote in order to vote. They don't know where their polling locations are. They don't know how to register, what the process for registering is. And so if we were able to kind of bring it in every step of the way and constantly remind them and educate them on this issue, then it's not such a daunting task, and it's not such a big thing, and it's not something that's kind of in the back burner of their minds when election season comes along.
So, oh my gosh. What I want to say is my job is to educate and serve voters. And I'm very passionate about my job. I love the job I do, and the people I work with are also very passionate about it. And we really do whatever it takes. And removing barriers is something that I've been advocating for and I support. And if we can make it work, we're going to make it work. And I've been doing this election work for 26 years now, and things have changed dramatically. We've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. And we want that voter experience to be a positive one so we can get our turnout up into the 80, 90%.
I'll just add one thing. I can't say it any better than what these 2 young women already, the way they framed the conversation, but maybe just from a different perspective, I guess 2 things. One, when we start talking about, maybe it's their own darn fault, right? Or they're out of luck, or they, whatever. What we're really doing is blaming the voter, and we have a long history in the United States of putting not only the responsibility of registering and voting onto people, but then to have barriers that are disproportionately impacting groups. It's not as if people have equally the choice or the access to both register and vote. But also, taking that a step further, when we do blame a young person or blame the sleeping giant or whatever, those darn kids, why don't they care or whatever, it's also a way of justifying inaction and sometimes even suppression of groups. So I always push back when I hear that narrative of maybe it's wrong to say that to think of it as in terms of everybody having kind of equal access and equal ability to just opt out of participating. There are lots of barriers that disproportionately impact different groups. But also, it's dangerous to use that and to even dialogue with that kind of, on that kind of topic. That makes sense.
Hey, Mindy, I wanted to ask you another question. Since as you're studying a number of the reforms that we're talking about today, and we're excited to see your research on CVR, can you speak a little to some of the challenges in terms of, we've passed a lot of new laws, and the challenges that you're facing in terms of the data that you're getting and how you're able to turn that into research that we can use to learn from these laws and better implement them?
That's a great question. I'll just put in a little plug, if I may, too, for those of you that might be staying over or coming tomorrow to the Secretary of State, James, Secretary of State's debrief on the VCA. There is a panel near the end of the day, leaving the best to last. The most exciting topic, no. But it's a data panel to talk about the challenges, specifically with regard to VCA, but the data challenges. So I think it'll be a really good conversation. Paul Mitchell and Jacob is also, if he's still here, is going to be on that panel. So to answer your question, yeah, there are a lot of challenges. I think first off, when we go down the path of enacting election reforms, we don't, and not just us, but other states as well, we don't give a lot of thought to how are we really going to be able to evaluate the impact afterwards. Is it really working? Is the law written like we hope it's written, right? And then is it implemented in a way that is actually functioning like we hoped, like the promise of that, whatever the reform is. And data is a huge part of that, right? To be able to hold, in a sense, that law accountable, those folks that are implementing it accountable. And I've been involved with various partners, Eric McGee on automatic voter registration, the VCA, we're going to be looking at conditional voter registration. And basically every reform, our wish list of data is extremely difficult to get. I'll leave it there, I guess. But to be able, what VoteCal was available from other sources, it's just a real challenge. And so, I would like to think as we go forward, when we think about new reforms, but also as we're potentially tweaking current reforms, the data is a big part of that conversation. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And so I want to imagine it's 2020 and we've passed a reform that says we're going to provide CVR more widely, whether it's at more satellite locations or at every polling site. And what would election day look like for you? But in particular, what would you like to see in terms of how we educate voters and do outreach to get voters to take advantage of it? And let's see who wants to start.
Well, I would still encourage voters to register by E-15. That makes everybody's life better. And for me, it just means that a lot more training, a lot more education of voters, and printing a lot more ballots.
Just to touch on the same thing that I mentioned a little bit earlier, I would say that the one thing that we need to prioritize and focus on, at least in college campuses and college communities, is institutionalizing voter registration into college systems. So this means working with a variety of key players on our campuses, having coalitions between these key players so that everything on campus runs smoothly. And this can range from anything from Res Life, so that students at move-in are registered to vote, orientation days, so that students are educated on the importance of voting, embedding voter registration sites onto our school websites, onto our school systems, in order to ensure that students are constantly seeing this, and it's a constantly visible thing that reminds students every single day that they log in their website or their student form. It means embedding it into, thinking about polling locations and precinct locations and working with college campuses in order to ensure that centralized locations on campus are available for polling locations during the 2020 elections. It's working with student life and the student committee in order to make sure that there are maps delegated so the students know exactly where it is that they need to go to vote with their precinct locations, and a variety of other ways of just really embedding it not just into our system, but into the culture of the school, so that students don't have FOMO or do know where to vote and how to vote and everything along the way. I think that voter education is definitely one of the things that should be prioritized during the first few weeks in order to ensure that there aren't incredibly long waiting lines during the polling location and things like that.
I mean, the one idea I want to throw out there is like having good data around where our people are registered, what the foreign birth of country is, so we can kind of guesstimate what languages we need, and then have an army of precinct captains who can be there to really support people, register, vote effectively, build relationships, and really take advantage of the opportunity that is to build community during that time.
Your question is what would we want to see in terms of registration or CVR specifically? CVR specifically?
Yeah, it's CVR.
Okay, just checking. I have to answer it more broadly too, sorry. Well, we've been talking a lot about young people, right, today, obviously. You know, I think we just don't prepare our young people, right, to register. I mean, so much of, and you've touched on it, saying that people don't know what the rules are, adults, whatever age, right? I think the more that we can, in schools, before young people turn 18, we can pre-register them now at 16 to 17. Understanding that conditional voter registration is available, it's a safety net, it's a very, very important safety net. But bringing all of that, I think there's still going to be a really big, hill to climb in terms of education of young people themselves, but also those that work with young people in terms of what their options are, that they have this safety net. And the more that we can do it, I think institutionally, instead of trying to grab, all the wonderful work that's done out there, but the more that we can institutionalize it on college campuses, that we can institutionalize conversations around this in a sense, that walking young people through the process, in high school and earlier, it's just really, really critical. And it's kind of like the prevention, the upstream, downstream kind of thing in some ways too, right? We're all fighting an uphill battle in terms of, researchers trying to understand this issue and those that are working on the ground. And really, so much more could be done and should be done before young people are even eligible to vote. Yeah.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're out of time. So everyone, let's thank our panel.